everyone, this is Catherine. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I want to help you get a good understanding of what JavaScript promises are and when you'd want to use them during web development. JavaScript promises are a lot like promises you make in real life. For example, if you call a shoe store and ask if they have a particular pair of Nikes in stock, and the sales rep says yes, then they're essentially making a promise to you that when you go into the store in person, that you'll be able to purchase the pair of shoes. If you go in and they have it, then we can consider that promise fulfilled. If you go in and it's already been sold out or there was a mistake, then we can consider the promise rejected. All right, so let's take a look at an example in the code. So the first thing we want to do is create a new promise, and in order to do that, we just call the new promise object constructor the way we would create any other JavaScript object. By the way, I'm using an arrow function here. So the promise constructor takes in a callback function as a parameter, and the callback function itself takes in two parameters, the resolve and reject functions. And it's inside this callback function where we're going to define the conditions upon which we're going to resolve the promise, and the promise is going to return us a value, or we're going to reject the promise and it's going to return us an error. So here, for example, what we could be doing is making an ajax request to the shoe store API to check to see if they actually have the shoe in stock, or running some other asynchronous function. For the sake of simplicity, we're just going to set in stock to true. So here we can say that if the shoe store has your shoe in stock that they promised, then we can call the resolve method because the promise has been fulfilled. Otherwise, if they don't have the shoe in stock, we will consider the promise rejected and call the reject function because they did not keep up their promise. Obviously, we know that this promise will be fulfilled because we hard-coded the value in stock to true. Now that we've defined the promise, we are now going to write the consumer functions that handles the result that we get from the promise. In order to do that, we call the .then method on our promise, and inside the .then, we pass in a callback function as a parameter, and that function runs when our promise resolves. We also have a .catch function, and that function runs when the promise is rejected. Now if we take a look in the browser and we refresh, we can see that we console log the string that we passed into the resolve function. Now if we change in stock to false and the promise will be rejected, we can see that now we console log whatever we passed into the reject function. So just to reiterate what I said, if a promise is fulfilled, then the resolve function will be called, and whatever we pass into the resolve function will be available in the .then. And of course, the same thing goes if the promise is rejected. Whatever we pass into the reject function will be available in .catch. One of the strongest use cases for promises is using it to wait for asynchronous functions to finish, like setTimeout or ajax calls. So I'm going to show you an example right now. So now I'm going to create a really simple asynchronous function, and what we're going to do is use setTimeout to wait 1 second before sending an alert to the browser. I'm just using setTimeout here for the sake of simplicity, but you can imagine that this is any other asynchronous function like making an ajax call or reading or writing from a file. Alright, now what if our goal was to wait for the asynchronous function to complete before we alert something? Also going to comment out the code from the previous example. So as it stands right now, the second alert actually runs before the first one because the first one waits a whole second and it's slower. So given that our goal is to wait for this asynchronous function to complete before we alert the second time, what we're going to do is we are going to wrap this into a new promise and return that promise from the function. And of course, we need to call the resolve function. What this is going to do is it's going to resolve or fulfill the promise after 1 second. Given that our asynchronous function returns a new promise, what we can do is call .then on the promise. Because .then will run after the promise resolves, what we can do is put in the second alert inside the .then callback function. So now if we run it again, you can see that it's going to wait 1 second for the set timeout, and then it's going to run the second alert after the promise resolves. So going back to our first example, what if we wanted to run several async functions sequentially? To illustrate this, I've copied and pasted a couple of async functions. So what we want to do is check if the shoes are available, and if that promise resolves, then we're going to check if there's sufficient funds available. And if that resolves, then we want to check if the transaction went through. The key here is that we want to wait for the previous promise to resolve before we move on to the next. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just using setTimeout here, but you can imagine that each of these are ajax calls that we want to run sequentially. In order to do this, all we need to do is return a promise inside the .then method of the previous promise. And like I said, when you call .then on a promise and that promise resolves, inside the .then, here you're going to have access to whatever you passed inside resolve. So what I'm doing here is basically calling a function that returns a new promise. But of course, you can also directly create and return a new promise inside .then. Because the .then method also returns a promise, we can call .then again and return the next promise we want to run, which is called transaction. This type of chaining one promise after another is also known as promise chaining. And this can be really useful in cases where we want to run several asynchronous functions one after another. Now let's also console log out finished, and this will run after the last promise has completed, which is transaction. Alright, so you can see that in this example, the last two promises, they both wait a second after the previous promises finishes before running because of the set timeout. So right now, all three promises resolve, but what if the second one throws an error? So you can see that because the second promise has been rejected, it's not even going to bother to try and run the third promise. So even if I throw an error from the third promise, it's really going to just stop at the second promise and go straight to the catch. Alright, now let's go back and resolve our promises again. The last thing I want to show you is something called promise.all. So say for example, you have several asynchronous functions you want to run, like the ajax calls that we had in the previous example. But in this case, you don't necessarily need for them to run in a sequential order. So what happens is promise.all takes in an array of promise objects and it runs them all at the same time, so in parallel. When the last promise in this array resolves, promise.all will return another promise object, which you can call .then on. Inside this .then, you'll have access to an array of all of the parameters you passed into the resolve functions. So when I go to the browser here and hit refresh, and I console log out the values parameter, you can see that it's an array of all the strings that were resolved from the promises inside promise.all. Alright guys, that's all I have for you today on JavaScript promises. If you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment below and someone from the community or I will be able to help you. Talk to you soon.